It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10. Our top story. The Prime Minister promises to boost defence spending to make the UK battle-ready in the face of threats from Russia and China.
The threat we now face is more serious, more immediate and more unpredictable than at any time since the Cold War.
But questions now about how Sir Keir Starmer will pay for his plans after he refuses to set a date for meeting his spending target. Also tonight, more peace talks between Russia and Ukraine end without a ceasefire deal. Portuguese police say they're carrying out fresh searches over the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. A man accused of a flamethrower attack at a pro-Israel rally in the US is charged with a hate crime and attempted murder. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Good evening. The Prime Minister pledged today to move the UK to war-fighting readiness and that every British citizen had a role to play. He was responding to the long-awaited Strategic Defence Review, which warned that the threat from Russia was immediate and pressing, and China presented a sophisticated and persistent challenge. Sir Keir Starmer insisted he was 100% confident that his planned boost to defence spending could be delivered within current funding plans. But he's been criticised after refusing to confirm when he'll meet his target of spending 3% of GDP on the armed forces. The Prime Minister said he wants to build 12 new conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. He also wants to spend £15 billion on the UK's nuclear warhead programme. He confirmed plans to build 7,000 long-range weapons, including drones and missiles, in the UK. Sir Keir also wants to establish 6 munitions factories to enable round-the-clock production. The UK currently spends 2.3% of its GDP on defence. This is due to be increased to 2.5% by 2027. But the Prime Minister did not commit to a target of raising defence spending to 3% by 2034. Our first report tonight is from our Security and Defence Editor, Deborah Haynes.
The Royal Navy on a training exercise, but the dangers are all too real. The Prime Minister says we're in a new era of threats that requires a different order of response.
Every part of society, every citizen of this country has a role to play, because we have to recognise that things have changed. The threat we now face is more serious, more immediate and more unpredictable than at any time since the Cold War.
But not so urgent that he's willing to turn an ambition for defence spending to increase to 3% of national income by the next Parliament into a firm commitment. It was a weak spot pounced on by his opponents.
The language around the government's announcements is definitely not firm enough. We need to get to 3% by the end of this Parliament. The world is getting more and more dangerous, and a lot of the things which they've announced in this Strategic Defence Review require money.
The funding row slightly overshadowed the unveiling of what's meant to be a key piece of work. This review is 140 pages long, containing warnings and solutions. One part describes the potential effects of war on the UK's way of life. This includes attacks on the armed forces in the UK and on overseas bases, air and missile attacks using long-range drones, cruise and ballistic missiles, targeting military infrastructure and critical national infrastructure, and increased sabotage and cyber attacks. On the state of UK defence, the review says its wider ways of working remain suited to a peacetime era, with innovation stifled and bureaucracy consuming precious time and effort. The result is an organisation that's not currently optimised for warfare against a peer military state. It made recommendations, though, saying, with rapid advances in technology driving the greatest change in how wars fought for more than a century, the UK must pivot to a new way of war. The team that led this review say it's about so much more than rebuilding the armed forces. It's about transforming the mindset of the country so that everyone is prepared for war. One of the reviewers described this as the most profound change to UK defence in 150 years. Whether or not that's the case, though, depends on what the government and all of us do next. And that could require tough choices.
We'd like to spend our money on the things we want, health and welfare and education, and have our potholes filled in. And the idea that you'd spend more money on defence isn't an easy one. But the fact is, if you don't spend enough money on defence, then many of those other things become irrelevant.
Being prepared was second nature during the Cold War. But is the UK willing once again to return to a war footing? Deborah Haynes, Sky News.
So can the UK really afford a big hike in defence spending? Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, has this analysis.
When it comes to defence spending, there's all sorts of numbers, as you'll see in a moment. Perhaps the most important one to focus on, though, is this. 2% of gross domestic product. That's the amount of spending that NATO has said for a long time that governments need to get up to. And when you look at kind of how much spending there is, this is the latest year, you can see the UK is just above that. Look, the UK, 2.3% of GDP. And you've got other countries, like, for instance, the US. There's the biggest spender of all. You'll see that in a second. And actually, Poland, as a percentage of GDP, so it's a percentage of the total amount of income across the economy, 4.1%. That's the biggest. But recently, NATO said, look, that should really be higher, 2.5% of GDP, and the UK has committed to that. But even more recently, Mark Rutte said maybe it ought to be about 3.5% of GDP. And if it's 3.5% of GDP, then basically no one apart from maybe Estonia, but really Poland, is over that line. But I said that this is looking at the percent of your total national income that you're spending on defence. What does it look like if you're just looking at the physical, the amount of cash you're actually spending? And the short answer there is, have a look at this. There is one clear big spender, and that is the US, by far and away the biggest spender of all. It's obviously got the biggest GDP, but also it's spending a lot of that on defence. And then there's the UK, and then everyone else looks pretty piddling in comparison. So that's the big picture. But if you look historically, there's something that many countries have in common, including, by the way, the US, which is that spending on defence since the kind of post-war period has been gradually trending lower. So we've all been spending less on defence as a percentage of our GDP. There's the UK, there's the US, with one exception. That says nearly everyone. Who's the exception? Russia. Russian spending has gone up sharply, and actually even before the Ukraine war invasion, it was going up already. It was trending higher. So the plan in the UK, according to Keir Starmer, according to this defence review, is to get this line, which has been gradually going down. It did used to be the biggest component of government spending, but it's gradually been going down and has been outpaced by things like health and social security. We've gone from being a warfare state into being a welfare state. But the plan is to get that line going up. And so that's already costed in 2.5% by 2027 to 28. But there is a plan, or at least there's an ambition, to get to 3% by the next Parliament. And then if it's 3.5%, well, that's that NATO request. That gets that line going higher. But what are the consequences? Have a look at this. This is showing you basically what we might have to spend on various bits of government spending if we're going to afford that 3%. So 2.5% is costed in. And if you have 2.5%, then potentially in the spending review, health goes up by maybe 2.5%, defence goes up by 2.5% as well, but the rest of the departments basically don't get anything in real terms in terms of that increase. But if you're assuming it's 3% of GDP going on defence spending, look at this bar. The rest of the government basically sees that going down. So down by 0.8%. The point being here that you have to find some money from somewhere in order to pay for that extra defence spending.
Well, our Security and Defence editor, Deborah Haynes, joins me now live from the Ministry of Defence. So, Deborah, concerns about the cost, but does this review show us just how worried the government is about Russia?
Well, yes, I've got the review here, actually, the Strategic Defence Review, all 140 pages of it that were released today. And actually, there is a section here where it specifically talks about Russia, calling it an immediate and a pressing threat. It says how the war in Ukraine has degraded a lot of Russia's land military capability, but if Vladimir Putin keeps his economy on a war footing, then he will be able to quickly rebuild that and pose a further threat. It also talks about China, though, describing China as a sophisticated and persistent challenge, and specifically hones in on China's capabilities when it comes to conventional and nuclear missiles that can strike here in the UK and across Europe. And it makes this stark, not revelation, but point that China's nuclear weapons stockpiles are going to double in size to 1,000 warheads by 2030. And it's the shaping of this kind of threat, the evolving nature of war, is the reason that underpins this call in the review to rearm, to rebuild not just the UK's military capabilities, but also national resilience. And the team of 3 external reviewers that led this process in a foreword at the beginning of the document draw on that saying, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Deborah, thank you. Meanwhile, a second round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine have ended with little progress on a ceasefire deal. But negotiators at the discussions in Istanbul have agreed to an exchange of prisoners. The talks follow an escalation of violence, with 5 people killed in Russian strikes on Ukraine, a day after Ukrainian forces destroyed a number of Russian aircraft inside Russia. Our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, reports.
Face to face in Istanbul, but with a gulf still between them. The setup for the latest peace talks serving to emphasise just how far apart the two sides are. Ukraine's delegation was again dressed in military fatigues. The Russians were in suits. While both sides wore stony faces, there is clearly no love lost. The talks ended after barely an hour. The only concrete outcome, another prisoner swap and the return of dead soldiers, even though the plan was to discuss each side's blueprint for peace.
A few days ago, we shared our documents with Russian side, but there has been no communication from them regarding their document until today. Only during the discussion today, Russians handed over its document to our delegation. Our teams will take a week to review the documents, and then we can coordinate further steps.
Russia's document reportedly reiterates its maximalist demands, including neutrality for Ukraine, the lifting of sanctions and recognition of its territorial claims.
The memorandum is quite detailed, worked out on our part. That is why the Ukrainian side decided to study it. They will study it. They will respond. We'll see.
The talks were overshadowed by Sunday's unprecedented attack. Ukrainian drones on Russian bombers thousands of miles from the border. This drone attack was humiliating for Russia and will undoubtedly prompt a response. Now, the Kremlin hasn't said what that might be, but plenty of hardliners have been offering their thoughts, with some even calling for a nuclear attack on Ukraine as retaliation. Not the kind of rhetoric you'd associate with a country that claims to want peace. But on Russian state TV, there was no mention of the attack ahead of the talks. Moscow's keen to play down its impact. And on the streets of the capital, opinions are split over its significance.
I think it's exaggerated because these planes are very old and hardly anyone needs them. Besides, they're firing from submarines.
I think there should have been a response already yesterday, and it should have been quite harsh.
So despite the talk of peace, the mood is one of war, and a full ceasefire still feels like a long way off. Ivor Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
Portuguese police say they're to carry out fresh searches on behalf of German authorities investigating the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Madeleine disappeared in 2007 while on holiday with her family in the Portuguese resort of Praia de Luz. It's understood these searches will start tomorrow near the former home of the prime suspect in the case, Christian B. The Sky's Alice Porter is with me now in the studio, and the whole area has been searched thoroughly previously. Why now? What's different now?
Well, German authorities, they've been leading the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann ever since they identified Christian B as their main suspect. Now, he is in prison in Germany for the rape of a woman in Praia de Luz, but the German authorities believe that he is connected to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Now, he has strenuously denied any allegations involving the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, but he's due to be released from prison probably by the end of this year. So from the German authorities' perspective, time is certainly ticking, and that's why we have ourselves at this point that German authorities have been meeting with Portuguese authorities today in order to begin their search tomorrow. That will go on all week, and roads have already been closed off in the area around Praia de Luz. You can see that tents have been erected there and roads have been closed off, and it will be this area, as you say, an area that has already been very well searched, that they'll be hoping to find new evidence. They're focusing on 20 plots of land in the most eastern part of Praia de Luz, and it is that area where Christian B owned a property at the very time of Madeleine McCann's disappearance. So that's why there is such significance to this particular area. So they're going to be searching the area, certainly hoping for either any evidence of Madeleine McCann or any human remains, as sad as it is to say that. So the focus of the efforts will be on this area. They haven't had a search in the area for 2 years. There was one 2 years ago. There was a search on a dam that's about 40 minutes from Praia de Luz where Madeleine McCann went missing. There was a search there 2 years ago. It was unsuccessful. And the key question really is whether this new search so long after her disappearance, I mean, she would be 22 years old today. She was, of course, 3 years old at the time. No one has been charged in connection with her disappearance. And, of course, for her family, desperate for answers. They're hoping that this new search may finally bring some answers to a mystery that has gone on for such a long time.
Yes, but all the while still very distressing for the family. Alice, thank you very much. To the United States now, and a man accused of attacking people with a flamethrower and petrol bombs at a pro-Israel rally in Colorado has been charged with a hate crime. At a news conference in the last half hour, prosecutors said the charges against Mohammed Suleiman also include 8 counts of attempted murder. Sky's David Blevins reports from Washington.
This is Mohammed Sabri Soliman, the 45-year-old Egyptian native, facing state and federal charges over what the FBI called a targeted act of terrorism. 12 people, one of them a Holocaust survivor, were injured, one seriously, in the attack in Boulder, Colorado.
There were 16 counts of attempted murder in the first degree. 8 of those counts are for attempted murder with intent and after deliberation. The other 8 counts are attempted murder with extreme indifference, so 16 counts total. If the defendant's convicted and those counts are running consecutive to one another, he would face a maximum of 384 years in state prison.
We're here, brother. We're here. We can't do nothing about that.
Still holding 2 bottles, still venting his anger. As victims lay injured on the ground nearby. They had been taking part in a weekly march in support of Israeli hostages in Gaza when they came under attack from a man wielding petrol bombs and a makeshift flamethrower.
And they had like really bad burns all up on their legs. And then I went over to this other grass area that was like right by the front entrance. And there were some people, there was another lady on the ground with really bad burns on her legs, just like screaming.
Police say they found another 16 unlit Molotov cocktails nearby and that the suspect had been planning the attack for a year. On top of the state charges, he's facing a federal hate crime charge. The Trump administration blamed President Biden's open door policy on immigration.
We know that this individual, this terrorist, was allowed into this country by the previous administration, was foolishly given a tourism visa, and then was illegally allowed to stay. These individuals are going to be deported, and we're not going to tolerate such violence in our country.
10 days ago, a shooting outside the Jewish Museum in Washington claimed the lives of 2 young diplomats. And in April, an arsonist targeted the residence of Pennsylvania's Jewish governor, Josh Shapiro. This latest violence will only add to the fears of America's Jewish community. David Blevins, Sky News in Washington.
A corporate manslaughter investigation has begun into failings that led to hundreds of babies dying at maternity units in Nottingham. Police say they're investigating whether the Nottingham University Hospital's NHS Trust has been grossly negligent. This report from our health correspondent, Ashish Joshi, contains images of a stillborn child provided by her parents that some may find distressing.
Harriet would have turned 9 this year, but it's another birthday. Her still grieving parents will never celebrate with her. Harriet was stillborn, but she would be alive today had the hospital listened to her parents' concerns.
We know what happened to Harriet. We knew the moment that she died. She had negligent care.
Harriet is one of the victims of the country's worst maternity scandal. And now the hospital trust who failed her is facing a corporate manslaughter charge.
We have mixed emotions. You know, it's absolutely great that this investigation has been opened, but there has to be accountability at an individual level. They go into work every day and some of them don't provide safe care, and there have been no sanctions, and that's what needs to change. So alongside the corporate manslaughter, we really believe that there needs to be individual accountability or the culture at the hospital won't change.
Nottingham University Hospital Trust is the subject of the largest ever NHS maternity review, being led by senior midwife Donna Ockenden. It includes more than 2,000 experiences of failing maternity care at the Trust, including deaths and injuries spanning more than a decade from 2012 onwards. In 2023, Nottinghamshire Police launched a criminal investigation into the Trust's maternity services. In a statement, Nottingham University Hospital's NHS Trust said, "We know how important the police investigation and independent review are for the affected families, the Trust and our local communities. We hope that affected families receive the answers that they deserve."
I think that there needs to be, in effect, a confession. We did wrong. I did wrong. That's what that means to me. How was it allowed to happen? Who knew what, when, and why were they still employed, and why was there no accountability?
These searching questions remain unanswered, but Jack and Sarah might now be taking one step closer to the truth. Ashish Joshi, Sky News.
The United Nations says the way aid is being distributed in Gaza violates humanitarian principles and cannot meet the mounting needs of people there. Health officials in Gaza say Israeli forces opened fire this morning and yesterday as thousands of Gazans gathered at an aid hub. Israel says its troops were firing warning shots to people who posed a threat to its forces.
In the last 2 days, partners reported scores of people killed and injured, apparently while gathering to receive supplies near the militarized distribution centers in Rafah and Deir al-Balah. The Ministry of Health in Gaza tells us that more than 40% of dialysis patients in Gaza have died since the escalation of hostilities in October 2023. This is because the centers were either struck or they are now unreachable.
A senior member of the previous US administration has told Sky News that he believes Israel has, without a doubt, committed war crimes in Gaza. Israel has strongly denied claims it has committed war crimes. Matthew Miller, who was a State Department spokesman under Joe Biden, has been speaking to our US correspondent Mark Stone on today's edition of the Sky News Trump 100 podcast.
Do you think what's going on in Gaza now is a genocide?
I don't think it's a genocide, but I think I think it is without a doubt true that Israel has committed war crimes.
You wouldn't have said that at the podium.
Yeah, look, because when you're at the podium, you're not expressing your personal opinion. You're expressing the conclusions of the United States government. The United States government had not concluded that they've committed war crimes, still have not concluded that.
But your personal view is they have.
And
they were while you were there.
But let me qualify that. There are two ways to think about the commission of war crimes. One is if the state has pursued a policy to deliberately committing war crimes or is acting reckless in a way that aids and abets war crimes. If the state is committing war crimes, and that I think is an open question. I think what is almost certainly not an open question is that there have been individual incidents that have been war crimes where Israeli soldiers, members of the Israeli military, have committed war crimes. And we do know that Israel has opened investigations, but look, we are many months into those investigations and we're not seeing Israeli soldiers held accountable. So ultimately, in almost every major conflict, including conflicts prosecuted by democracies, you will see individual members of the militaries commit war crimes. And the way you judge a democracy is whether they hold those people accountable.
But Israel hasn't.
That's my point,
right.
Is we have not yet seen them hold sufficient numbers of the military accountable. And I think it's an open question whether they're going to.
Matthew Miller there. 4 people remain in hospital after a car rammed into crowds at Liverpool's Premier League victory parade last week. Merseyside police say more than 100 people are now known to have been injured during the incident. A 53-year-old man is facing 7 charges, including malicious wounding and causing grievous bodily harm. A 4th man has been arrested by police investigating fires at 2 properties and a car linked to the Prime Minister. A 48-year-old man was arrested at Stansted Airport on suspicion of conspiracy to commit arson with intent to endanger life. 3 men already charged in connection with the fires are due to appear in court on Friday. Police are warning that organised criminal gangs are increasingly using rented houses and flats to operate illegal cannabis farms. They say it's putting the lives of innocent neighbours at risk. Sky News has been given access to an operation by Greater Manchester Police, who raided a house on an otherwise quiet suburban street where a cannabis farm was being run. Our chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milam, has this report.
It's early in the morning and we're with officers from Greater Manchester Police. On this quiet suburban street, they suspect a house is being used as a cannabis farm.
Please, stay where you are. Clear.
Inside, they find one room full of cannabis plants. This alone enough to generate an estimated £20,000 per crop. Upstairs, there's cannabis, bagged up and ready for distribution, prepared in an elaborate drying room, and with the high electricity demand obvious. The man who was in the house is arrested on suspicion of cultivating cannabis. In the meter cupboard outside, police find another telltale sign.
There's a bit of wiring behind there.
Right, so you think they put it behind? So the electricity gets bypassed in order to avoid big electric bills because a substantial amount of electric is required. We've seen a lot of fires recently in premises that have been set up as cannabis farms because the electricity isn't like the way that it's set up is not safe.
The risks of cannabis farms were highlighted by the death of 7-year-old Archie York, killed in an explosion caused by chemicals being used in a cannabis factory in a block of flats. Increasingly, police say they're finding cannabis farms inside rented properties, making it harder for them to track the organised crime gangs responsible. The most junior members, known as the gardeners, happy to take the rap.
It's exceptionally difficult, obviously. When you get a cannabis farm and the gardeners are arrested and detained, they plead guilty at the earliest opportunity, it's a quick win for policing. But what's required is to go beyond that and start to look at who's controlling that. What we see with those cannabis farms is rival organised crime groups will actively target those. Massive amounts of money to be made in cannabis, without a shadow of a doubt. And they'll use significant violence against anybody that gets in the way.
We only found out when we went into the property. I can only explain it as horrific.
Even the chief executive of the British Landlords Association fell victim.
Members, they are shocked. They didn't know it could happen. They are not aware of the telltale signs. They have the same regrets what I experienced, that regular inspections, and if somebody's offering you a larger bulk rent, then you should question that.
400 cannabis farms have been detected in Greater Manchester in the last year alone. The rewards are huge, the costs low, and those living nearby unaware they face the greatest risk of all. Greg Milam, Sky News.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by political commentator Adam Bolton and the deputy political editor of The Guardian, Jessica Elgott. Amongst the stories we'll be discussing, this on the front of The Guardian. Its headline, Starmer pledges to make Britain battle-ready with drones and AI. We'll be right back with that story and others. Do stay with us.